How's it going? I'm Jordan, one of the team members here at Elevate. It's great seeing you all tune in each week. It's been personally inspiring for me to see countries all around the world accessing our online experience. Whether it's breakfast, lunch or dinner, grab a coffee, sit back and relax.
Now the darkness fades into new beginnings as we lift our eyes to a hope beyond. All creation waits with an expectation to declare the reign of the Lord our God. We will not be moved when the earth gives way, for the risen one has overcome. And for every fear, there's an empty grave, for the risen one has overcome. Now the silence breaks in the name of Jesus, as the heavens cry, let the earth respond. All creation shouts with a voice of triumph to declare the reign of the Lord our God. Hey, we will not be moved when the earth gives way, for the risen one has overcome. And for every fear, there's an empty grave, for the risen one has overcome. He shall reign forever, strongholds now surrender, for the Lord our God has overcome. Who can be against us? Jesus our defender, he is Lord and he has overcome. He shall reign forever, strongholds now surrender, for the Lord our God has overcome. Who can be against us? Jesus our defender, he is Lord and he has overcome. We will not be moved when the earth gives way, for the risen one has overcome. And for every fear, there's an empty grave, for the risen one has overcome. We will not be moved when the earth gives way, for the risen one has overcome. And for every fear, there's an empty grave, for the risen one has overcome.
Walking around these walls, I thought by now they'd fall, but you have never failed me yet. Waiting for change to come, knowing the battle's won, for you have never failed me yet. Your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands. This is my confidence. You never failed me yet. I know the night won't last. Your word will come to pass. My heart will sing your praise again. Jesus, you're still enough. Keep me within your love. Oh, my heart will sing your praise again. Your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands. This is my confidence. You never fail. Your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands. This is my confidence. You never fail me yet. I've seen you move, can move the mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way, and I believe I'll see you do it again. I've seen you move, come move the mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way, and I believe I've seen you do it again. I've seen you move, come move the mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way, and I believe I'll see you do it again. I've seen you move, come move the mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way, and I believe I'll see you do it again. I'll see you do it again. Come move again. Oh, your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. my confidence. You never fail. Your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands. This is my confidence. You never failed me yet, and I never will forget. You never failed me yet, and I never will forget.
Hey, g'day to our Elevate Online family. Great to have you joining us from wherever it is in the world that you are joining us from. We're here in Perth, Western Australia, coming out of lockdown, as are many places around the world. Reflecting on lockdown, though, one of the incredibly great things that happened during lockdown is it actually brought the timeline forward for us to launch our online experience. And even though we in Perth have resumed our live experience, we've decided and committed to actually having Elevate Church in 2 locations, where our live experience meets here every week in Perth, Western Australia. And we're going to continue our online experience and actually trust God is going to lead us and cause us to be able to reach more people and build more people throughout the world using our online experience, and ultimately building a community. An online community around the world, part of Elevate Church, just as much a part of Elevate Church as if you were living in Perth. Obviously, some things will look and feel a bit different, but because of technology, we can do that. We can connect with you, we can invest into you, and we can actually build a level of relationship. So we're really excited about that here, and looking forward to that journey with you. And by the way, if you're also thinking of some people you know in your sphere, wherever they are in the world, I encourage you to share this with them and invite them to come on this journey with us. That'd be fantastic. Today we're continuing our series, How Not to Be Your Own Worst Enemy. And this idea of being your own worst enemy is probably something you've seen other people do. You've seen other people be their own worst enemy when it came to their career, when it came to their relationships, when it came to their finances, when it came to their health. You've seen people destroy themselves, and as they've gone through this process, there's every chance you've kind of just stood back and scratched your head and thought to yourself, you know, why are they doing that? I mean, it's so obvious to you that they're being their own worst enemy, but why are they doing it? And the answer is very simple. The answer as to why they are being their own worst enemy is because in the beginning, they started giving themselves bad advice. And from giving themselves bad advice, they actually listened to that bad advice rather than rejected it. And then they went on to act on that bad advice. And as a consequence, through that process, they became their own worst enemy. Now, real talk, you've done it as well, and I've done it as well. You and I, at some point or points, have been our own worst enemy. And the reason I know this, and I said this in the first week, is because you were involved in all of your bad decisions. Just like your friend that you observed become their own worst enemy and burn up a part of their life, you've done the same thing. You've given yourself bad advice. You've listened to your bad advice, and you've acted on your bad advice. On reflection, you probably shouldn't have given yourself that bad advice, or if you did, you would have been wise to have rejected that bad advice, but you didn't. And then even having listened to it, it would have been wise to have not acted on it, but again, you did. And I've done the same thing as well. And in that process, we've become our own worst enemy. There's something else that's important to understand about this idea of burning up part or parts of our lives and becoming our own worst enemy, is that in almost all cases, it's not only you that's impacted. That when we burn up parts of our lives, it impacts other people. It impacts our family members, our friends, our colleagues, our kids, our parents. And the other thing it impacts is it impacts our ability to influence other people. If you're the person whose trajectory of their life looks like they're consistently, time after another, being their own worst enemy, then you will ultimately see your influence erode, because who would want to follow you and follow your advice if you're known for giving bad advice to yourself? So this 3-week series is all about how not to be our own worst enemy. We started week 1 talking about pay attention to the tension that God's hardwired or built a conscience into our internal operating system. And that as we come up against things, approach things, thinking, saying, doing, things that we start to feel a little bit guilty about and get this kind of internal that we need to pay attention to that tension. Push pause and pay attention. Last week, Steve did a great message on pay attention to your narrative. Just how important it is for us to understand the effect our inner dialogue has on our decision making, has on the outcomes in our lives. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, go back and watch one or both of those two parts of this series. This is week 3, and this is the third and final part of this series. And today I want to talk about paying attention to wise voices. Now, it was English psychologist Peter Wasson who coined a phrase that you may very well be familiar with. The phrase is confirmation bias. And he talked about it from the point of view of confirmation bias being our tendency to selectively gather and retain information. And typically, the selection process is that we gather and retain information from people who think like us, who look like us, who grew up like us. And the danger of doing this is that we will find ourselves inside a bubble, and you cannot grow from inside that bubble. And then in the last decade, social media has just taken off. And social media, by its very construct, actually plays to our confirmation bias. That, in fact, the algorithms within the major social media platforms, anything from YouTube to Instagram to Facebook, the algorithms are actually designed to reinforce our confirmation bias by virtue of the fact that the very articles, posts, etc. that we heart or like or share, the algorithm works to actually show us more of the same stuff. So we need to be aware that we have a confirmation bias, and also be aware of external factors that actually are playing to our confirmation bias, because by living inside our confirmation bias, we're actually living inside a bubble, and we won't grow inside that bubble. Now, if you've got a device handy, please, I'd encourage you, grab it, open the Bible app, and go to 1 Kings 11. 1 Kings 11, I'm going to dive in from the Message. And I'm going to take you to a point in history which, as the name of this book suggests, is about the kings of Israel. And drop in a point in history which, just prior to this, Israel had and still has, the third, but had three kings. That Saul was the first king, and I talked about him, and then his successor David, I talked about him in the first week of this series, so go back and watch that. That each of them was a king for 40 years, Saul followed by David, and then David, when he died, he handed over the succession, went to his son Solomon, and Solomon was the king for about 40 years. And I'm going to drop you into, or drop us into the slice of history where Solomon is still the king, although he's nearing the end of his life. And by this stage, because they'd had three kings, the succession plan was kind of set in place, where the firstborn son would become the next king upon the death of the current king. And that's something that still happens in various monarchies around the world today. So Saul to David to Solomon. And the natural succession was Solomon's son Rehoboam. Now, I need you to underline or make a mental note of that name, Rehoboam, because I'm about to read a guy whose name is similar, but it's not the same. And if you get them too confused, then this entire message is not going to make any sense to you. So Solomon's son was Rehoboam, and he was intended to be the successor to the throne, the fourth king of Israel, upon Solomon's death. All right, 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 28. Jeroboam, again, not Rehoboam, Jeroboam stood out during the construction as strong and able. I'll explain that in a second. When Solomon observed what a good worker he was, he put the young man in charge of the entire workforce of the tribe of Joseph. Now, this is the context. Jeroboam was promoted to essentially like a ministerial position or a cabinet position, kind of like a head of construction or head of infrastructure for the nation of Israel. And this post was an incredibly big deal because Solomon at that time, who was incredibly wealthy, considered to be potentially the most wealthy person that's ever lived, he was building so many buildings and monuments to himself that he actually had engaged almost the entire male population of Israel as his workforce. About 150,000 men employed as stone cutters and stone carriers. So this post that he was elevated to was an incredibly significant post. Important fact to insert in there, this 150,000 workforce were essentially indentured labor. Though they were servants in Israel and people of Israel, Solomon had gotten in the habit of treating them like slaves, and that's important to understand and remember that thought. Okay. So Jeroboam, not Rehoboam, Jeroboam, he'd now been promoted to this very important national political position. One day, Jeroboam was walking down the road out of Jerusalem. Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, wearing a brand new cloak, met him. Now, when a prophet comes to you, it's either with great words of encouragement or great words of warning. Let's see which one this was. The two of them were alone on that remote stretch of road, and Ahijah took off the new cloak that he was wearing and ripped it into 12 pieces. Sometimes prophets do some crazy things just to get your attention. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 of these pieces for yourself. This is by order of the God of Israel. See what I'm doing. I'm ripping the kingdom out of Solomon's hands and giving you, Jeroboam, not Rehoboam, the 10 tribes." And so what was this all about? I mean, Solomon's the king of Israel, considered to have been one of the wisest people that had ever lived. And now this prophet appeared in front of Jeroboam, this newly elevated cabinet minister, and ripped his cloak into 12 pieces and told Jeroboam that God is going to give out of the 12 tribes of Israel, going to give 10 of them to Jeroboam, who was not the successor to the throne. And the reason for this, and the reason why God was angry, the reason why God was looking to actually change course and shift the succession plan, was that Solomon had started worshiping other gods other than the God of Israel. What had happened is to consolidate his power, to expand his power, to instigate peace treaties throughout the regions, Solomon had gotten in the habit of marrying the daughters of various other leaders and rulers in the known world, and in doing so, striking a peace treaty with them. And he married so many women that he couldn't even remember their names. He just assigned them numbers. And in doing so, in forging these treaties and aligning himself with this broader alliance around the region, he started agreeing to worship their gods as well. And he started building temples to their gods and becoming essentially a pagan in his own right, which the God of Israel wasn't happy with, because that's not what the God of Israel had asked of him. And then the prophet went on speaking on God's behalf. That's what prophets do. Still, he said, I won't take the whole kingdom away from Solomon. I'll stick with him through his lifetime, because my servant David, whom I chose, and who did follow my directions and obey my orders. But after that, I'll remove the kingdom from his son's control and give you 10 tribes. Now, if you'd had an encounter like this, you probably would have told someone, and so it's no surprise that Jeroboam started telling people, man, I was out walking outside of Jerusalem. This guy turns out to be a prophet, wearing a new cloak, comes up to me, rips it up, 12 pieces, gives me 10, tells me God's going to give me 10 tribes. And this story started getting out. I mean, it was an incredible story. It started getting out among the region, and eventually this story made its way to King Solomon. But by that stage, the message that got to King Solomon was that Jeroboam was setting himself up to be the next king of Israel, setting himself up to mount a coup to become the next king of Israel. So Solomon ordered the assassination of Jeroboam, but Jeroboam got away to Egypt and found asylum there with King Shishak. And he remained in exile there until Solomon died. There it is, folks. Solomon died. And upon his death, the natural succession, it was in place, was that Solomon's son Rehoboam would become the next king. So Rehoboam traveled to Shechem, where all Israel had gathered to inaugurate him as king. Jeroboam had been in Egypt in exile, away from Solomon's bounty that he'd put on his head, where he'd taken asylum from King Solomon. When he got the report of Solomon's death, he thought he was safe, and so he came back. And Rehoboam assembled Jeroboam and all the people, and they said to Rehoboam, your father made life hard for us, worked our fingers to the bone. Remember, treated them like slaves. So they requested of the new king, give us a break, lighten up on us, and we'll willingly serve you. I mean, what an offer. That at the end of the day, these people who'd been treated like slaves under the new king, they were willing to commit to the new king, that they would willingly serve him. Difference between a servant and a slave. We'll keep working hard. We'll be committed to you. We'll serve you willingly. But they had one request. Can you just lighten up on us? And the new king, King Rehoboam, in that moment made two very wise decisions. And the first thing he said to them was, give me 3 days to think it over and then come back. You know, he didn't know what he was going to do. He didn't know what the wise thing for him to do was, and he didn't want to make a rash decision. And he's the new king, the new leader. He didn't want to make a rash decision. So he just said, come back in 3 days. Let me think about it. And then I'll give you my decision. Very wise, very wise. In fact, in leadership, the higher the consequences, the more, it's not always time that you need, but certainly the more consideration you need to give to something because of the implications that your ultimate decision will have. And then the second wise decision that the new king made, King Rehoboam talked it over with the elders who had advised his father when he was alive. What's your counsel? He asked them. How do you suggest that I answer the people? Two very wise decisions. In fact, one of the cliches, and I am on record previously on more than one occasion of making this point, one of the cliches that I actually don't agree with, it gets thrown around a lot, but I actually don't agree with it. I think it's actually a little bit myopic, is this cliche, experience is the best teacher. And the reason I don't particularly like that is because I don't actually agree that experience is always the best teacher. Because, first of all, if experience was the best teacher, then once we've made a mistake once, we'd never repeat it again. And yet we, and people we know, have the habit of making the same mistakes again and again and again. And in fact, they're building up more and more experience, but not seemingly learning something from those experiences. So the actual experience itself isn't the best teacher. Learning something from the experience is critical. The second reason I'm not such a fan of that cliche is it doesn't have to always be our experience that we learn from. We don't always have to pay for our own education. We don't always have to be the one whose lives get thrown against the rocks, who burn up aspects of our lives in order to learn something. That instead we can actually, if we're wise, we can actually go to other people who have gone before us, who have some wisdom that we don't, who see some things that we don't, who may be able to shine some light on our blind spots. That in that case, experience is a great teacher, but it doesn't have to be our experience. It can be other people's experience. And so these elders that had served Rehoboam's father, King Solomon, said, look, if you will be a servant to this people, be considerate of their needs and respond with compassion, work things out with them, they'll end up doing anything for you. See, it's important to understand that these elders, they actually had two superpowers. They did have the superpower of having had experience. They would have no doubt seen Rehoboam when he was in the delivery, coming out of the delivery room with mama, and seeing him growing up as a child. And they had experience and perspective that he didn't have. They also had a second superpower. And the second superpower is they had nothing to lose and nothing to gain by speaking truth to the new king, by speaking truth to power. However, King Rehoboam, having initially made two very good decisions, telling the people, give me 3 days to think about it, and then going to some elders to get some perspective, his confirmation bias kicked in. He decided to retreat and go back to his bubble, to the people that he knew, the people he grew up with, the people he was familiar with. And inside that bubble, inside that echo chamber, he asked a second group for their perspective. Rehoboam rejected the counsel of the elders and asked the young men he'd grown up with, who, by the way, were now currying his favor, what do you think? What should I say to these people who are saying, give us a break from your father's harsh ways, lighten up on us? And the young Turks he'd grown up with said, these people who complain your father was too hard on us, lighten up. Well, look, tell them this. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. I don't have time to explain the significant of that statement in that culture, but just a very simple translation is, you thought my father was big and powerful, I'm even bigger and more powerful, and this is how I'm going to show it. If you think life under my father was hard, you haven't seen the half of it. My father thrashed you with whips. I'll beat you with bloody chains. Too many people, when it comes to making a decision, ask the question, what do I want to do? You know, I'm going to go with my heart. I'm going to go with my gut. You know, what do I want to do? Here's a warning. Prison is full of people who did what they wanted to do. The best question when you're facing a decision isn't what do I want to do? The best question is, what's the wise thing to do? And in this case, with the new king Rehoboam, he had two conflicting groups giving him two conflicting sets of advice. And it would have been better, would have been optimal for him to ask the question, what's the wise thing to do? But he didn't ask that question. He rejected the counsel of the elders who had nothing to lose and nothing to gain by telling him the truth. And he went to people that were trying to get something from him, people with limited wisdom, limited experience, who were trying to get something from him, and he couldn't filter it through the lens of what's the wise thing to do. And so it's critical for you and I, if we don't want to be our own worst enemy, don't want to become our own worst enemy, it's critical for us to pay attention to wise voices. Though in order to do that, it requires a filter. How do we filter who are the wise voices? Because the reality is, for you and I, by way of media, by way of social media, by way of the people around us, friends, family members, colleagues, etc., there's a lot of incoming. There's a lot of incoming noise. There's a lot of incoming advice. There's a lot of you should, I think, let me tell you something. And it's constant. And you know this. And you can't listen to it all. In fact, it's not wise to listen to it all. There has to be a filter. There has to be a filter that delineates between the counsel, the advice that we would be wise to take on, and the advice that we would be wise to reject. And the filter that I use and recommend is super simple. I mean, it's so simple, it's almost embarrassing. It's so simple, it's almost like, is that it? Yeah. Well, I have to tell it to you first. But it's so simple that when I say it, people are like, huh? So here it is. Here's my filter that I use and recommend to screen, to delineate what advice to take on and what advice to reject. It's very simple. It's 3 words. Follow the fruit. Not follow the fruities or the Fruit Loops. Follow the fruit. In other words, consider the source of the advice. Consider the fruit that's being produced in the lives of the source of the advice. And beyond the advice itself, what sort of fruit is the source producing in their lives? And the clue is it the sort of fruit that you hope to achieve and produce in your life? That's a clue for who I recommend you take advice from versus you reject the advice of. If somebody who the fruit of their life is terrible, that should be a clue. You know, if you want to have a great marriage, a strong marriage, a thriving marriage, then listen to people who have the fruit of great, strong, thriving marriages. If you want to have thriving health, if you want to have thriving finances, if you want to have thriving relationships, if you want to have a thriving business or career or academic pathway, then look for people and listen to the advice of people who are displaying the fruit of those things in their life. So when I say part 3, final episode of how not to become your own worst enemy, it is vital to pay attention to wise voices.
I've loved this series. A way that we can continue to journey with you is by you accessing our Elevate app, where we have group notes where you can continue to discuss this with your friends, your family during the week. I mentioned earlier that I've been incredibly inspired seeing people tune in from all over the world. A way that we can keep furthering our reach is by giving, and if you do feel like that's something that you want to do, there are ways to give and they'll come up on the screen. An easy way to make sure that you never miss our online experience is to like, subscribe and share. One of the traditions that we have here at Elevate is letting you know what the coffee of the day is. Today, it's Guatemala Ayatha. See y'all next week.